A millionaire walks in and sees the black woman dancing. But not alone. She's moving with his disabled son, and the boy is moving back, just a flicker at first, then more. What happens next leaves the entire house speechless. Have you ever seen dignity unfold in silence? If this moment touches something in you, tap like, subscribe, and let us know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Dominic Harper sat at the edge of his son's bed, staring at a boy who didn't stir. Not when the morning sun leaked through the tall windows, not when the nurse adjusted the heart monitor with a quiet sigh, not even when Dominic whispered his name. Noah. Nothing. The boy's eyes blinked but slowly, like a reflex without meaning. His arms lay stiff by his sides, his legs curled at unnatural angles beneath a soft cotton blanket. The child was 8 years old. He had never said dad, never smiled, never cried. Sometimes Dominic wondered if Noah even knew he existed. The room was silent, except for the slow hum of air purifiers and machines too modern for anyone over 50 to understand without a manual. Every surface gleamed. There was no clutter, no chaos, no sound of toys or scattered crayons or cartoons in the background. Just the order of stillness. It had been like this for years. Camille's perfume still lingered in the linen of the master bedroom. She had died the night Noah was born. Blood loss, complications, a flurry of urgent voices, the flashing of red lights in the hallway, and then silence. Dominic had never really heard silence until that night. Since then, it had taken root in the house, in the boy, and in Dominic himself. He had not remarried. He had not dated. He had barely spoken to anyone unless necessary. Work ran on autopilot. The home was more a memorial than a place for the living. Catherine, his late wife's longtime assistant, stood in the kitchen reading a clipboard. Her eyes were sharp as ever, her posture upright. A woman who had always believed that proper planning prevented poor performance. She was the kind who alphabetized herbs and ironed handkerchiefs. Now she also helped manage Noah's daily therapies. Without her, Dominic might have let it all unravel years ago. The new therapist didn't last, she said, not looking up from the paper. She says she'll forward the report, but there wasn't any progress. Dominic nodded once quietly, placing a hand on his son's motionless arm. It was warm. That was the only comfort. They're all the same, he muttered. Well, perhaps not all, Catherine said, then hesitated. She glanced out the window, as if she didn't want to finish the sentence. But she did. The last one. The woman from Queens. The black woman. She was enthusiastic. He didn't respond right away. She didn't have formal certifications in pediatric neurology, Catherine added, at least not the kind we typically look for. And frankly, I thought her tone was a little informal. Dominic stood and walked over to the window, looking out at the city. It was early spring. The trees were still bare, but patches of green tried to fight through. She seemed like she genuinely cared, he said, not with conviction, but with the weariness of a man who had seen too many people pretend. Catherine adjusted her glasses and clipped the papers together. I think we need someone more clinical, someone trained in advanced cognitive. He cut her off. Find whoever's left, whoever hasn't been through here already. There weren't many. Dominic walked into the hallway that led to Camille's old dance room. She had been a dancer, a beautiful one. He still remembered the first time he saw her perform back in college, her arms moving like music made flesh. He had been in finance, of course. Suits, numbers, ambition. She had been the spark in every space she entered. The room was untouched. Her leotard still hung in the open closet. The hardwood floor still polished weekly. On one wall was a large framed photo, Camille mid-spin hair, catching the light grace in full bloom. Beside her was another young dancer, also in motion, face slightly turned away from the camera, her skin darker than Camille's. The image had faded with time, and the name on the corner had been smudged. Dominic had never asked who she was. Camille had once said something vague, a friend from her first summer school recital. It didn't matter, he had thought. But now he stared at the photo longer than usual. Something about the posture of the girl, the way her feet curled slightly inward mid-pirouette, it stirred a thought that refused to settle. He turned away. Downstairs, David, his assistant, was reviewing care schedules on a tablet. The man was efficient, careful with words, and made sure everything stayed on time. Dominic liked that about him. He didn't bring emotion into things, but even David had stopped believing in the rotation of therapists, though he never said it. The last 3 weeks have all had the same result, David noted, without being prompted. But I did find someone new. She's not typical. Dominic raised an eyebrow. Not licensed in the usual way, David clarified, but she's worked with kids. Has experience in care homes, community centers, that sort of thing. Catherine overheard. Let me guess, she said dryly. No degrees, but plenty of life experience. David didn't reply. Dominic shrugged. Fine, book her. There was no more fight left in him to sort out what credentials mattered. No method had worked. No textbook had cracked the code. His son had not spoken, not smiled, not hugged anyone since birth. If anyone could move the dial even a little, it was worth a shot, even if they came from a church basement in Queens instead of a university in Connecticut. That night, Dominic sat alone in his study. The clock ticked like it had something to say. He stared at the unopened whiskey bottle Camille had bought for his birthday, the year she died. He never drank from it, probably never would, not out of honor, just habit. His eyes moved across the desk to the baby monitor where Noah lay in his bed. The screen showed no movement, just the soft rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the city breathed, blinked, shimmered. But inside this home, time stood still. The next morning, before the sun had reached its full height, a quiet knock sounded at the front door. The knock at the door was soft, barely more than a whisper against the wood, but it echoed through the Harper apartment like an unexpected note in a long, silent song. Catherine was already up dressed, as if attending a board meeting, her eyes landing on the grandfather clock before she moved to open the door without needing to ask who it was. Dominic remained upstairs, still standing by the window, watching the world wake up without him. The woman on the other side of the door didn't look like a therapist. She didn't carry a briefcase or a binder, no clipboard, no credentials on a lanyard, no stiff posture or professional smile. Instead, she wore soft canvas shoes and a faded olive green jacket that looked like it had been mended more than once. Her hair was tied up loosely, not unkempt but practical. She held a cloth bag over one shoulder, and in her hands, nothing but a folded sweater. "You're early," Catherine said, not quite warmly. "I know," the woman replied simply. Her voice was even calm, without apology. "I like to see the space before the work begins." Catherine stepped aside slowly. "This is not a daycare," she said, more out of habit than necessity. "It's a medical residence. We expect professionalism." The woman walked in without offense, her steps soft, her eyes scanning the hallway like she was listening to more than sound. "Understood." David appeared at the end of the hall, tablet in hand as usual. He looked up, noting the lack of formal attire, the absence of a resume in hand. He raised an eyebrow, subtle but clear. "She's not what I expected," he muttered. Dominic had come down the stairs by then, catching only the last bit. He didn't ask for introductions. Instead, he looked at her for the first time. "Ariel Santiago." She nodded once. "Yes." He didn't ask for degrees, references, or previous employment. There was something in her stance, not confidence exactly, but a kind of stillness that made the usual questions feel unnecessary. He gestured toward the hallway. "This way." They walked to Noah's room. The hallway felt longer than usual. The walls were lined with photos, some of Camille, some of a younger Dominic, all stiff with time. None of Noah, not yet. Inside the room, Noah lay in the same position as always, arms tucked in, legs bent awkwardly, eyes open, but fixed somewhere near the ceiling. He didn't flinch when they entered, didn't track movement. The air smelled of antiseptic and lavender, a strange mix of clinical and tender that defined the Harper home. Ariel didn't speak to the adults in the room. She walked to the far corner and placed her bag down gently. Then she sat cross-legged on the floor and pulled a soft cloth from her sweater, no brighter than old denim. Without asking, she began wiping a corner of the baseboard. David leaned into Dominic. "Is she cleaning?" Dominic didn't answer. Catherine folded her arms. "This isn't what we hired her to do." But Noah blinked, slowly once. His head moved a slight tilt, barely there, but real. Ariel began humming. The tune wasn't familiar. It wasn't loud. A slow, winding blues line that curled and settled into the room like a low breeze. It had no lyrics, just breath and pitch shaped by memory rather than sheet music. Noah's fingers twitched. Catherine narrowed her eyes. "Is that music therapy?" "No," Ariel said, her voice low, still humming between phrases. "It's just something my mama used to sing." Dominic stared. It was the first time he'd seen movement in his son that wasn't induced by a machine or a reflex test. He didn't say anything, didn't want to break the moment. He just watched. Noah's eyes drifted, not fast, not sharply, but they moved toward Ariel. David whispered, "Did you see that?" Dominic nodded once. He didn't look away. Ariel continued humming as she slowly stood up. She walked past the others and gently adjusted the curtain, letting in more morning light. Then she turned to Dominic. "Where's his music?" Dominic blinked. "His what music?" she said again. "Everyone's got a sound that wakes them up." What was his mother's favorite song? He hesitated. She danced to so many. Ariel didn't push. She simply said, "Start with what you remember." Then she picked up her bag, nodded at Noah, who blinked again slowly, and made her way toward the door. "Wait," Catherine called. "You're leaving." "I've seen enough for today," Ariel said. "He saw me. That's a start." And just like that, she was gone. Dominic stood in the silence she left behind. It wasn't like the silence that usually filled the house. This one felt different, less heavy, less final. He looked at Noah. For the first time in years, he wasn't just lying there. He was looking at something, at someone, not through them. Catherine shook her head slightly. "I still think we should have gone with the specialist from Boston." Dominic didn't respond. He walked to the corner where Ariel had knelt and looked at the baseboard. Clean. Not because it needed to be, but because she had chosen to touch something, to start somewhere. "She's different," David said quietly. Dominic replied without turning his head. "That's the point." Ariel returned the next morning without a word of confirmation. No reminder call, no email, no message to confirm an appointment. Just like before, she showed up precisely at 7:45 with the same quiet step and calm presence. Catherine opened the door this time without greeting. Her eyes, sharp and expectant, scanned Ariel from head to toe. There was no sign of credentials again, no change in wardrobe. Just a slight shift today. Ariel carried a small wooden box under one arm, scratched at the corners. The brass latch faded from time. Catherine's gaze lingered on it, her suspicion, as unspoken as it was palpable. Dominic, who had spent most of the night in his office replaying yesterday's brief moment, Noah's eyes, that soft blink, the slow drift of attention, walked down the stairs just as Ariel stepped inside. He didn't speak to her, but something about his movement, less rigid, less automatic, suggested a new kind of alertness. David, as usual, hovered nearby with his tablet. He made no effort to hide his watchful eye. In his world, documentation mattered. Results needed data. And so far, Ariel's presence had offered neither. Ariel entered Noah's room without hesitation. Noah was in his usual position, but there was a subtle difference. His body wasn't as tightly curled, his fingers less clenched. It was something Dominic had noticed, even if he hadn't mentioned it. Ariel placed the wooden box gently on the windowsill, then turned to Noah. She didn't speak to him. Instead, she sat on the floor again, her legs tucked beneath her. The room was quiet except for the distant hum of the building's HVAC and the rhythmic click of David tapping on the tablet's glass. Then she opened the box. It was a music box, clearly old, the kind that required winding. Ariel turned the key slowly and the melody began. It wasn't crisp, but it wasn't broken, just aged. The tune floated out like something from a half-remembered dream. A lullaby or a folk song, maybe, but wordless. Soft, deliberate, repetitive. Noah's hand flinched, just a twitch, but more than yesterday. Catherine, standing in the hallway, leaned in with a frown. "Is that sanitary?" Dominic turned slightly. "It's a music box. It's unsupervised equipment," she added. "We don't know where it's been." Ariel didn't react. She stayed seated, her eyes on Noah, not forcing a reaction, not gesturing, just present. Catherine stepped into the room, arms folded, her voice lowered, not a whisper, but with enough edge to cut. "People like her," she muttered to David, "they work with their hands, not their minds." Ariel, still facing Noah, responded without turning. "Some people hear sound, others just measure decibels." David blinked, unsure whether to respond. Dominic's jaw tightened, not in anger at Ariel, but in realization of Catherine's tone. He looked at Noah, who now had turned his head slowly but clearly toward the music box. He moved, Dominic said. It wasn't loud, more like a breath escaping. Catherine shook her head. It could be involuntary. There's no way to know if he moved, Dominic repeated. Toward the sound. Ariel stood slowly. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She walked to the windowsill, rewound the box, and let it play again. Noah's eyes followed her hand this time. That small act cracked something in Dominic. Not a revelation, not yet, but something like the first dent in a long, frozen wall. He took a step forward, watched his son's gaze shift with deliberate interest, and spoke to Ariel for the first time since she'd arrived that morning. "What was that song?" She shrugged. "No title. My mother hummed it when I was sick. Said it helped the body find itself again." David finally spoke. "Do you have any credentials for this documentation case studies?" Ariel looked at him. and for the first time smiled faintly, not dismissively, but as someone who understood the difference between asking a question and needing control. "I have experience," she said, "and time." Dominic looked at David. Let her continue. Catherine frowned. "Dominic?" He turned to her. She gets something out of him. No one else has. There was no debate after that. Catherine left the room. Her footsteps clipped controlled, as if leaving were a statement. David made a note on his tablet but said nothing more. Ariel knelt back down and spoke this time, not to the room, but to Noah. "I'll come back tomorrow, if you want me to. You don't have to answer." Noah blinked. Dominic stood in the hallway after she left, watching the space she had occupied. The box was still there, playing faintly. He walked to the photo wall and looked at the old picture of Camille dancing. His eyes paused at the young girl beside her, the one with her face turned just enough to be unreadable. Something stirred, not a memory exactly, but a question that had long gone unasked. In his office that night, he didn't turn on the desk lamp. He sat in the dark and listened to the echo of that melody still playing in his mind, over and over, like a thread pulling something loose inside him, something he had buried long ago. And for the first time in 8 years, he didn't take a sleeping pill. It happened on a Thursday morning, just after the air in the house had settled into its usual rhythm of quiet footsteps and measured routines. Dominic had barely slept again, though he hadn't reached for the sleeping pills. He sat at the kitchen table nursing coffee he didn't really want, watching the steam fade into nothing when Ariel arrived. She didn't knock this time. Catherine had told her to come in directly. Her footsteps were soft, steady, as if she knew her way around the home better than someone who had only been inside it for 2 days. She carried nothing today. No music box, no bag, just herself, and a red silk ribbon folded neatly in her hand. Dominic followed her down the hall without saying a word. Something about the way she moved told him this day would be different. Maybe it was how lightly she held the ribbon, or maybe it was the silence that followed her, not the oppressive kind that had filled the house for so long, but something quieter, gentler, with a hint of anticipation rather than dread. Noah was lying in bed, the same as always, but his eyes flicked toward the door the moment she entered. That single motion had become a kind of ritual, now a sign he was not just existing, but attending to what moved around him. Ariel gave him a small nod, sat on the floor again as if there was no reason to change what had started to work, and stretched her legs out in front of her. She unraveled the ribbon, held it between her fingers, then let it flutter like a wave through the air. Noah's eyes followed it, slow but steady. Without announcement, Ariel began to move. Her body swayed gently at first, her arms tracing arcs in the air, the ribbon streaming behind like a slow brushstroke. It wasn't a dance meant for display. It was for something else, perhaps memory, perhaps hope. The motion wasn't perfect. Her left foot slipped slightly on the hardwood. The ribbon tangled once in her fingers. She caught it, untwisted. It smiled softly and continued. Dominic watched, leaning against the doorway. He didn't know what he was supposed to be feeling, but he knew this was not how therapy usually looked. Then, just as she spun lightly on the ball of one foot, Ariel fumbled. It wasn't dramatic, just a brief trip over her own heel that made her stumble backward and land squarely on her backside with a soft thud and a surprised oof. She blinked, looked around, and burst into a laugh, not forced, not staged, just amused. Dominic opened his mouth to say something, but didn't. Noah's chest rose a little more than usual. Then, as Ariel reached for the ribbon with mock seriousness like a clown who'd lost control of her props, it happened. Noah laughed. It was faint, cracked like the first sound from an old speaker, but it was unmistakably a laugh. His lips curved, his eyes lit. A thin sound escaped from his throat that had never formed that shape before. A sound not caused by spasm or reflex or choking, but joy. Ariel froze. She didn't turn to Dominic, didn't look toward Catherine, who had entered moments earlier and now stood stiff by the door. Instead, she lowered her hands, let the ribbon rest on the floor, and simply nodded once, barely more than a breath of movement. Dominic moved without realizing it. He stepped forward, not fast, not loud, just walked up to Noah's bed and stared. His son was still smiling. It wasn't wide or perfect, but it was there. A crack in the armor, a warmth in a room that had been sterile for years. Catherine's face was unreadable. Her mouth was pressed in a thin line, her eyes fixed not on the boy, but on Ariel. Something shifted behind her gaze. Not admiration, not relief. Maybe confusion. Maybe discomfort. Later that day, after Ariel had left without a word of praise or validation, Dominic found a photo on the kitchen counter. It was unframed, unannounced. A print from decades ago, the edges slightly curled. It showed Camille in mid-dance, one leg extended, arms overhead, a smile of fierce focus on her face. Next to her, slightly out of frame, another girl's skin, darker hair tied in a similar bun face, turned just enough to blur. The photo had clearly been taken in motion, yet there was balance, symmetry, connection. He held it in both hands for a long time. Didn't ask Catherine where she'd found it. She didn't volunteer the information either. She just refilled the kettle and returned to her list of medications. That night, Dominic didn't go to his office. He sat beside Noah's bed. The boy was asleep, his body still curled but less rigid. His hands weren't clenched. His breathing was deep. Dominic turned the lamp down low and reached for the music box Ariel had left on the windowsill. He wound it once, let it play. Then he leaned back in the chair, closed his eyes, and for the first time in years didn't dream of hospitals or funerals. He dreamed of movement, of laughter, of the sound his son had finally made, the one that mattered more than any diagnosis ever had. The morning after Noah laughed, the house felt different. Not louder, not warmer exactly, but looser, somehow, like something long coiled had begun to unspool. Dominic noticed it in the way the curtains moved or the fact that he didn't flinch at the sound of shoes on the hardwood. He stood by the window in the hallway, holding a mug of lukewarm coffee, and watched as Ariel entered through the front gate same time as always. She wore a plain blue sweater and linen pants, her hair pulled back. In her hand was that same red ribbon folded tight. But there was also something else, an easiness in her shoulders, a softness in her jawline that hadn't been there before. She looked up and met his gaze through the window. Didn't smile, but didn't look away either. Dominic nodded. Ariel nodded back. Instead of heading straight to Noah's room, Ariel asked for the first time if they could try something different. She spoke quietly, almost like she didn't want to interrupt the silence the house had grown used to. "Does he ever go out on the balcony?" she asked. Dominic shook his head. "Not in years. It's warm." "Just for a few minutes," she said. "I'll carry him if you're okay with it." Dominic hesitated, then glanced toward Catherine, who had just appeared in the kitchen. She raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. He turned back to Ariel and gave a short nod. "All right, I'll help." Together they lifted Noah from the bed carefully with practiced gentleness. His body was still thin, still tight in places, but he didn't resist. If anything, he seemed more alert now, his eyes blinking steadily as they carried him through the hall and out the glass doors onto the stone balcony. Morning light spilled across the space, warm and direct. The garden below had begun to turn green again after the dry months. Birds fluttered around the feeder. It was a different world from the bedroom, and Noah seemed to notice. Ariel sat him upright in the cushioned wicker chair closest to the railing. She didn't say anything. She didn't rush. She tied the ribbon loosely around her fingers, stood a few feet in front of him, and began to move. It was not a performance. Her movements were slow, fluid, deliberate. The ribbon unfurled with each gesture, spirals, figure eights, arcs that caught the sun and fluttered like the hem of a forgotten costume. She didn't look at Noah as she danced, at least not directly. Instead, she watched the air around him, letting the rhythm stretch and pause like a breath drawn and held. Noah's gaze followed, at first just his eyes, then something else. His hand, the one that usually curled against his stomach, lifted just a few inches, then higher. Then it moved shakily but with intent, mirroring the ribbon's arc. Dominic sucked in a breath so suddenly that Catherine, who had stepped out behind him without a word, looked up. She saw it too. The hand, the lift, the trace of movement that wasn't random, that wasn't reflex. Ariel kept dancing, didn't react. She let the moment belong to Noah. When she finished, she untied the ribbon and placed it on the small table beside his chair. Then she crouched next to him, looked him in the eye. Not talking down, not over-explaining. "Thank you for dancing with me," she said softly. Noah blinked once slowly. Dominic didn't speak. He didn't move for a while. When they lifted Noah back into his wheelchair and rolled him inside, he turned back to the balcony once more, as if trying to hold on to something he wasn't ready to name. Later that afternoon, while David was adjusting Noah's medical records and Catherine was out at an appointment, Dominic returned to his office. He opened the drawer where he kept family photographs, most of which hadn't been touched in years. He pulled out the picture of Camille dancing, the same one Catherine had left without comment, and placed it on the desk. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, Earlier that morning, while Ariel was with Noah, he had taken a photo on his phone, nothing staged. Ariel, in mid-movement ribbon, extended Noah's hand, visible lifted in frame. He printed it using the small photo printer he rarely used, trimmed the edges, and placed it beside the old photo. Camille and Ariel, years apart, one in black and white, one in color, different worlds, different stories. But somehow the photos fit beside each other, as if they had been waiting for that moment. Dominic sat back, stared at the pair of images, and felt something unexpected, a kind of quiet recognition. Not understanding, not yet, but something close to truth. He didn't need to say it aloud, and no one needed to agree. That afternoon, when Ariel left, she passed by his office. He opened the door, held the edge of the frame, and said simply, "You were good out there." Ariel smiled almost shyly. He was better. Dominic nodded once. "See you tomorrow." And for the first time, he said it without doubt, without hesitation, as if something had finally shifted, even if the world hadn't noticed yet. It was sometime in the late afternoon when Catherine decided to clear out the cabinet beneath the old fireplace. No one had touched that space in years, not since the remodeling, and even then it had been an afterthought, an awkward nook with a stubborn latch and a shallow drawer that never quite closed. She hadn't meant to open anything, just dust around it, maybe sort the files Dominic no longer cared about. But when her hand brushed against the back panel, she felt a subtle looseness, a shift of something thin and flat wedged behind the wood. It took some effort and more patience than she usually gave things these days, but after a bit of careful maneuvering, a small box emerged, lightweight, covered in soft dust, and clearly untouched in more than a decade. She didn't say anything. She just stared at it for a while before placing it on the kitchen table. She waited until the house was quiet. Dominic had gone upstairs with Noah, and David was on a supply run. Ariel was out back, seated cross-legged near the garden, taking notes in a small leather notebook she always kept tucked into her bag. Catherine opened the box slowly. Inside were papers folded neatly, some still sealed in envelopes bearing the logo of a local dance center that had closed years ago. Others were handwritten letters, their ink slightly faded but legible. One envelope stood out, labeled in thick, deliberate handwriting, for Camille only. The seal had been broken, but the letter remained inside untouched. Catherine pulled it out and unfolded the page. Her hands didn't tremble, but her breath did. The writing was unmistakably that of Charles Harper, Dominic's father. It was dated over 20 years ago. Camille Grace Santiago never asked for anything. Not recognition, not favor, not exception. But that girl, Ariel, she has rhythm in her blood. She doesn't move like the others, and it isn't technique. It's something else. She learns before you teach. She listens to music with her whole body. She belongs on stage, but the foundation will never sponsor her. You know how these things work. The board's not ready. And frankly, neither is the name Santiago on any donor plaque. I'm sorry. Catherine folded the letter back slowly, her jaw tightening. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she reached for the next item in the box, a small photo printed in low contrast of a group of dancers mid-rehearsal. Camille was front and center, arms extended. Behind her, slightly blurred, a smaller figure, skin darker hair pulled back tight, moving in step. Ariel, younger, unmistakable. Catherine didn't cry. She didn't rage, but something in her stiffened, less out of guilt, more out of recognition. The kind that didn't come easily to people like her, people raised to believe they were always on the side of what was correct. Dominic found her at the kitchen table half an hour later, staring into the box. The letter opened the photo beside her hand. "What's that?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pushed the letter toward him. He picked it up, read slowly, lips moving slightly with each word. When he finished, he read it again. "She was there," Catherine said quietly. "The girl in the picture. She danced with Camille. That's her." Dominic looked at the photo, then out the window, where Ariel had returned to her usual spot on the bench near the back hedge. She was humming something soft, eyes closed. She never said a word, he muttered. "Would you have?" Catherine asked. If you were her, Dominic didn't answer. He left the photo where it was, but pocketed the letter. That evening, when the house had settled again into its quiet rhythm, he went into his study. The room still held traces of Camille, her books on anatomy, music scores tucked between philosophy texts, an old metronome that hadn't ticked in years. Dominic sat at her desk and placed the letter flat before him. He opened his laptop, found the folder where Camille had saved her old performance footage, and searched until he found the file marked Rehearsal, Final Selection. He clicked play. The video was grainy, shaky in places, but it showed what he needed. Camille in motion, confident and sharp as always. And behind her, yes, there she was, the younger Ariel dancing not in competition, but in harmony. Even with the blur, the camera angle, the years between them, the rhythm was unmistakable. He paused the video, leaning forward until his forehead nearly touched the screen. So that was the truth. He thought about the conversations they'd had, him and Ariel, or rather the ones they hadn't had, the things unsaid. Her silence now had a weight not just of dignity, but of restraint. She had every right to confront him, to call out what his father did, what his mother allowed, what even he, by omission, had continued. But she never had. She danced. Dominic stayed in the study until late. When Ariel passed the doorway on her way out, she glanced in, saw the light, paused. "You need anything?" she asked. He shook his head. "I found a letter. From my father." Ariel tilted her head. "Oh, it mentioned your mother." A pause. Then gently, "Grace didn't talk about it much. But I knew something had happened, something that made her stop." Dominic looked at her directly. It shouldn't have. She should have kept going. "She did," Ariel said simply. "Just not on stage." He nodded, stood slowly. "You've been doing this for a while, haven't you? I started dancing before I could write my name." He smiled faintly. "I believe that." She started to turn away. "I'm sorry," Dominic said. Ariel stopped. "I know." Then she walked down the hall, same pace as always, not hurried, not heavy. And Dominic sat back down in the chair his wife had once claimed as her own, the letter still resting open, the video still paused on a single blurry frame of two girls dancing, one remembered, one almost forgotten, both finally seen. The next morning the house didn't speak. It moved, it functioned, it breathed in its own rhythm, but the silence was different now. It wasn't a void, it was deliberate. Each person inside that home carried something they hadn't had the day before. Knowledge, memory, or guilt. Maybe all three. Dominic came down early, not dressed in his usual tailored slacks and button-downs, but in jeans and a pullover sweater that still smelled faintly of the cedar chest upstairs. He didn't go straight to the office or the kitchen. He went to Noah's room and sat in the chair by the window without saying anything. Noah was awake, eyes wide open, not blinking too often, just watching the morning sun stretch across the floor. Ariel arrived at her usual time. She didn't ask about the mood or the changed energy. She gave Dominic a small nod and stepped into her rhythm with Noah, like she always did without ceremony. This time, Dominic stayed in the room. He didn't hover or interject. He simply watched. When Ariel asked Noah to shift his gaze, he did. When she brought out a small tambourine and tapped the side with her fingers, he followed the sound with his head. There was no miracle moment, no breakthrough or gasps. Just attention. Just presence. Dominic, for once, wasn't looking for progress. He was just watching his son be a person. Later that day, David knocked gently on Dominic's office door and stepped inside, holding 2 cups of coffee, steam curling upward. He handed one to Dominic without asking, then leaned against the doorframe. They stood there a moment, not quite relaxed, but not tense either. David shifted from foot to foot, then finally spoke. "You know," he said, "when she first came here, I didn't think she'd last a week." Dominic looked up, eyebrows slightly raised. "Ariel, I thought she was too soft-spoken, too different. No credentials from Ivy programs, no letters after her name, just a reference from someone I barely knew." He paused, swirling his coffee. "But now, I've never seen Noah look at someone like that, like he's trying to remember something he never got to say." Dominic didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the corner of the desk where Ariel's ribbon still rested coiled, like a quiet witness. "She doesn't ask for much," David added. "That says something." "Yeah," Dominic said. "It does." That afternoon, Catherine sat alone in the sunroom, flipping through an old scrapbook she hadn't opened in years. Most of the photos were of Camille Competition's recitals rehearsals, but in the corner pocket of one page, nearly hidden behind a concert program, was a snapshot Catherine didn't remember placing there. Camille and another girl sitting backstage, feet bare, arms around each other's shoulders. Camille's head tilted in laughter, the other girl's smile small but certain. Grace Santiago. Catherine stared at the photo for a long time. Then she closed the book gently, as if afraid to disturb the memory. She whispered aloud to no one. "She caught Camille once, just before a fall. No one saw but me. I never said thank you. I don't know why." She didn't expect an answer. None came. Meanwhile, Ariel had asked if she could take Noah outside. The weather had softened. The cherry trees in the park nearby were in bloom, and the air smelled faintly of grass and faint sunshine. Dominic helped lift Noah into his chair. He didn't offer instructions. He just asked, "You need anything?" Ariel shook her head. "Just time." They walked down the path behind the house, slow but steady. Ariel pushed the chair gently, speaking to Noah in that same soft rhythm she always used, like music laced with breath. "My mother," she said after a while, "used to say she heard music before I was born, said I danced before I had legs. She'd hum to me, pat her belly, say I kicked in rhythm. I didn't believe her until I started hearing songs in my sleep." Noah didn't speak, but his head tilted, his eyes focused not on the path ahead, but on her profile. Grace never got much credit. She worked in places where people only noticed if she was missing, but she never stopped moving. She danced in our kitchen in the hallway, once even in the rain, because she said, "No one owns the rhythm but those who let it pass through." Ariel laughed a little, not bitter, just remembering. I asked her once why she never fought to be on stage. She said, "Some stages weren't built for girls like me, but your body is your own theater. Don't wait for a curtain to open." Noah's hand twitched lightly on the armrest. Dominic watched from a short distance away, having followed them halfway, but choosing not to intrude. He stood near the edge of the fence, pretending to check his phone, but watching everything. Ariel reached into her pocket and pulled out a tiny wind chime not more than a few inches tall. She hung it on the side of the chair. The breeze was light but enough. The soft clink of metal sounded like punctuation to the air around them. "That's for you," she said. "Not for therapy, just to know you can still move something that makes sound." Back at the house, Catherine stood at the kitchen counter, slicing apples. She didn't look up when Dominic entered. "She took him to the park," he said. "I know," Catherine replied. "I saw from the window." "You ever talk to Grace, really talk to her?" "Once. After rehearsal." Camille had twisted her ankle. Grace wrapped it faster than any of us could react. I said thank you. She nodded. That was it. "Did you know she danced?" Catherine hesitated. Then quietly, "I knew. I just never thought to ask why she stopped." Dominic leaned against the doorframe. His voice was low, not accusatory. "Maybe we were all too busy being in the light to see who was holding it." Catherine placed the knife down. "Do you think she resents us, Ariel?" "No," Dominic said, "but I think she remembers, and I think she makes sure Noah does too." The day ended without any declarations, no dramatic scenes. But that night when Ariel left, she didn't just nod goodbye. She paused at the door, looked at Dominic, and said, "He likes the park. There's a rhythm there." Dominic smiled. "Maybe we'll go again." She didn't smile back, but her eyes warmed. Good. Then she was gone. Upstairs in Noah's room, the wind chime clinked once before sleep took the house again. The next day unfolded with a quiet certainty, like a page already written but not yet read aloud. Dominic rose earlier than usual, his footsteps deliberate but not hurried. The morning sun had just begun to settle across the wooden floors of the hallway when he entered his study and placed a small envelope on the desk. Inside was a letter. No header, no signature, just words that mattered. Then he waited, not for a moment of grand timing, but for the next ordinary one. Ariel arrived shortly before 10. She looked the same: denim jacket, small tote bag, her hair tied back in a loose knot, but there was a difference in her eyes, as if the air around the house had told her it was time to expect something. She greeted David with a gentle nod in the hall. Catherine offered a barely audible "good morning," then returned to reading at the kitchen table, her glasses resting low on her nose. When Ariel stepped into the study, Dominic was there, sitting at the edge of his armchair, like someone who didn't want to look too casual or too serious. He gestured toward the desk, toward the envelope. "I wrote this last night," he said. "It's not legal paperwork, not official, just words, but they're mine." She walked over, slowly picked up the envelope, and opened it without sitting down. Her eyes scanned the page, her face unreadable. He didn't watch her read. He stared out the window, hands clasped tightly together. There was a pause, longer than he expected. Then she folded the letter carefully and placed it back on the desk. Dominic finally turned to face her. "I don't know what you'll want to do, or if you'll want to stay. But if you do, I'd want that to be by your choice, not because of obligation or pity or history, just because you see something worth continuing." Her gaze didn't waver. "What is it you think I am to you?" He didn't answer right away. Then I think you're someone who brought my son back to me, who reminded me that silence doesn't mean absence. I think you're someone my wife trusted once, and maybe someone I failed to see in full." Ariel tilted her head slightly. "You're not asking me to stay as family." "No," he said. "I'm asking you to stay as yourself. If that intersects with us, then I'd be honored. But I won't define you." There was a stillness between them, then not heavy, just suspended. Then she nodded once. "Good," she said, "because I don't need another father. I had one. I don't need someone to take me in. I've always known how to stand. What I need, what I want, is to be seen fully, and not as a footnote to someone else's redemption arc." Dominic's mouth tightened slightly. He didn't bristle. He absorbed it. "You're not a footnote," he said. "If anything, you're the sentence we didn't know was missing." She smiled barely. "Careful." That almost sounded poetic. "I've been around dancers," he said. "You all rub off." She didn't answer. She didn't promise anything. She just picked up the letter again, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her bag. Then she said, "I'll be in the studio with Noah." He nodded. Later that day, as she worked with Noah in the upstairs room, Catherine passed by the open door. She watched silently as Ariel spun a slow turn holding a ribbon Noah had begun to reach for. It was subtle, but it was movement. When Ariel noticed Catherine watching, she didn't stop. She kept going, letting Noah follow the arc of her body. When it was over, Catherine stepped into the room. "He used to watch Camille like that," she said. "From the wings." Never blinked. Ariel didn't reply, but she did meet Catherine's eyes. "I used to think," Catherine continued, "that the right people would rise on their own, that if someone deserved recognition, it would come naturally." Ariel finally spoke. "Recognition doesn't fall. Someone hands it over." Catherine nodded. "That's true. I see that now." There were no apologies, no explanations, just two women standing in the same room, finally sharing the same understanding. That evening over dinner, David cleared his throat and raised his glass slightly. "To Noah," he said, "and to the people who make sure he's seen." Dominic didn't say anything, but he reached over and gently touched the folded paper resting near his plate, the copy of the letter he'd written Ariel left there, not as a statement, but as a reminder. The rhythm of the house had changed again, not louder, just clear. The next morning came gently without ceremony. Ariel arrived just after breakfast, her steps light, and measured her breath, matching the calm of the air around the house. She carried with her a small box no bigger than her hand wrapped in cloth. Dominic had seen her step in from the hallway, but he didn't call out. He simply watched as she made her way up the stairs to the room where Noah was waiting. There was a kind of grace in how she moved, not forced, not overly careful, just aware. Every inch of her presence in the house now felt like it belonged. Inside the room, the light streamed in at an angle that made the pale walls glow. Noah sat near the window, still and quiet as always, but something in his gaze tracked her movement across the floor. Ariel didn't speak to him right away. She knelt down on the carpet, opened the cloth-wrapped box, and took out two small wristbands. Each had a tiny silver bell sewn into it, no louder than a whisper when shaken. She looked over at him and said softly, "Today, I want you to hear yourself move. Not for me, not for them, just for you." Noah didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. That alone was enough. She slipped the bands gently around his wrists and sat back. No music, not yet. Just the weight of the silence and the pulse of a space waiting for something to begin. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small Bluetooth speaker, turned it on, and let a slow jazz track fill the room. Nothing flashy, just a rhythm steady and warm, like a heart still beating after a long winter. Then she stood and began to move. No sharp angles, no choreography. Just breath-meeting beat. Her arms swayed like a slow pendulum, and the fabric of her sleeves brushed softly as she turned. Noah watched her. Then, without anyone asking him, his left hand lifted slightly. The bell chimed barely, a soft, almost hesitant sound. Ariel didn't stop. She didn't even acknowledge it. She just kept moving, giving the moment space to grow. Then came the second sound, his right wrist, this time more deliberate, as if he knew what he wanted. The two bells made a small duet of motion and sound. Still, no words. Dominic stood just beyond the doorway, watching. He hadn't meant to be there. He had passed by on the way to the kitchen and stopped when he heard the music. And now he couldn't move. He held onto the frame of the door with one hand, breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. When Noah lifted both arms and then began to shift his weight forward, Dominic stepped in just one step, almost without realizing it. Noah's foot moved. One step, the smallest step, but his own. The bells rang again, louder this time, not because of volume, but because of meaning. Dominic's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He crossed the room, dropped to his knees, and wrapped his arms around his son. Not tightly, not desperately, just present. Fully. Finally. Present. His head dropped to Noah's shoulder, and he stayed there, as if the ground beneath them had finally turned solid. Ariel didn't speak. She stepped back, watching, letting them have the moment. Her own throat tightened, but she refused to let it cloud the clarity of what was unfolding. For the first time since she had entered the house, she felt it shift beneath her, not pushing her out, not holding her at arm's length, but adjusting to include her. Catherine entered moments later. She must have heard the bells too. She stopped when she saw the scene, her hand rising slowly to her mouth. Her eyes didn't move from Noah, who now rested his head on Dominic's shoulder. Then, as if time had waited long enough, Noah whispered one word. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was real. Mommy. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Catherine let out a single gasp. She stepped forward but didn't speak. She just knelt near them, her hand hovering over Noah's back, not quite ready to touch, but needing to be close. Ariel finally walked to the window and opened it slightly. The outside air was cool and crisp, filled with the scent of garden soil and distant leaves. Noah looked up. He didn't smile, not quite, but his eyes found Ariel, and he blinked slowly as if nodding in a language only they spoke. Dominic turned too, and this time he didn't look at her as someone who worked in his house. He looked at her as someone who had altered its foundation, someone who without a single raised voice or dramatic speech had taught them how to listen again. That afternoon, no one spoke of it in grand terms. There was no toast, no declaration. But when dinner came, Noah sat at the table instead of being carried to it. Catherine placed a folded napkin gently in his lap. Dominic passed him a spoon, and Noah gripped it, even if shakily, with both hands. When the meal ended, David, who had watched from the hallway, turned to Ariel and asked, "Did you plan any of that?" She shook her head. "You can't plan that. You just make space for it." David smiled, nodded once, and walked away with a tray in hand. The bells remained on Noah's wrists for the rest of the evening. He didn't shake them again. He didn't need to. Everyone had already heard what mattered most. And for the first time in a long time, the house felt quiet, not because it was empty, but because it was whole. The morning of the opening arrived in a hush that felt deliberate, almost reverent. The sun's gentle rays filtered through the tall windows of the renovated studio, casting long, soft shapes across the smooth wooden floor. No ribbon was cut, no grand unveiling. Just an open door light spilling out and a chorus of quiet readiness. Children arrived slowly, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, others supported by small figures standing close at their back. Each face carried hope, uncertainty, and the belief that for once someone had carved out space just for them. Ariel stood near the entrance, arms folded gently, eyes observing. She had chosen a simple outfit, a dark denim jacket over a soft cotton blouse, hair tied neatly to keep the focus on her face. She offered soft smiles to parents, small waves to children. She didn't need to speak. Her presence spoke clearly. You belong. Dominic lingered at the back of the room. His tailored suit had been replaced by khaki slacks and a crisp white shirt, an intentional nod to blending in. He watched Ariel watch the children and watched the shifting light. As the first few children began to move, gentle steps, tentative sways of arms, quiet reaches for scarves floating from the ceiling, he felt his heart tighten not with pride, but with recognition. This was no spectacle. This was quiet courage made visible. After a few minutes of movement, Dominic stepped forward to the center of the room. His steps carried the weight of a father who had learned to listen long before speaking again. He glanced at Ariel, catching her eye briefly, then turned back to the group of families gathered at the door. If you ever thought you had nothing to give, he began, voice steady, thoughtful look at these children. They give the world what it forgot to trust, to believe, to feel hopeful again. His gaze swept the room, pausing on a child who gently closed her eyes as she moved her shoulders, then on another boy who shyly held up a handbell and let a single chime ripple through the air. "Thank you," he continued, "for trusting us enough to walk through that door." There was no applause, just nods, soft smiles, and the quiet acknowledgement that his words were both for the parents and for Ariel, an acknowledgement that her vision had become a place of healing and presence. Ariel watched her chest lifted, but she did not step forward. She remained behind Dominic, letting the moment belong to the families and to the movement itself. In her mind, she replayed every second of Noah's journey from his first gentle shake of a bell to this moment where dozens of children were finding their own rhythm. Later, as the session ended, mothers and fathers moved to collect their children. Some offered whispered thanks to Ariel. Others nodded to Dominic. A few even caught Catherine's eye in the back. She simply lifted her hand in silent applause, tears glistening behind her glasses. David, the Harper household's former assistant, stepped quietly to Ariel's side. He offered her a cup of cold water. "She's amazing," he said softly, nodding toward a little girl who had been the most hesitant at the start and now stood shoulders relaxed, a gentle brow's edge turning up in quiet triumph. "You made space for her to try." Ariel accepted the water with a nod, her throat tight. "They just needed permission," she whispered. David offered a small, knowing smile. "And you gave it." By noon, the studio had emptied. Chairs were stacked. Ribbons on the ceiling swayed quietly. Dominic approached Ariel as she folded up the fabric tapestries that had been hung around the walls. He offered his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. She paused, folding her hands around the fabric. She met his eyes. "It was never just me," she replied. "It took all of us." He nodded. "Yes, all of us." Behind them, Catherine appeared, keys in hand. She had been there through every rehearsal, always from the edge. "I brought lunch," she said quietly. "I thought, maybe you'd like to eat here today." She looked between Dominic and Ariel to celebrate what didn't need a stage. They shared a quiet smile and followed her into the small adjoining kitchen where sandwiches waited, and the low hum of conversation began to fill the space with warmth. That afternoon, the studio was still. Ariel sat on a low bench, legs folded beneath her eyes, closed for a moment as she allowed herself a pause. In the stillness, she remembered a time less than a year ago when she stood uncertain in that doorway, a stranger carrying a name no one wanted to speak. Now the room held her world. Dominic returned and sat beside her. "Would you consider running another session next week?" he asked, voice gentle. "We have a few more families asking." She opened her eyes and nodded. "We will." He paused, then added, "When you're ready to welcome others, maybe mothers who need the same kind of permission, families who never asked for much." Ariel studied his face. "I think I'd like to start that." She took a breath. "I want to offer a group for parents, for people who need the space as much as their children do." Dominic's eyes softened. "That would be wonderful." In that moment, they both felt the momentum of something larger than today, a ripple that would continue. Later, they gathered to leave. The sun had shifted. Golden light stretched along the hallway. Dominic turned to Ariel. "Thank you," he said once more, not for her presence, but for bringing the pulse back to a family and a home that needed it. She smiled softly. "Thank you for seeing it." They stepped out together, leaving the studio door open behind them, light streaming out, waiting for the next chapter to begin. 1 year had passed since the doors of the Pulse Center first opened, and though there were no signs or slogans added to the front, something had changed in the rhythm of the air itself. The building, modest and whitewashed, sat calmly between a post office and a bakery on the east side of town. No banners, no advertising, just a small, hand-painted wooden plaque beside the entry, "Movement for those who stayed still." It wasn't a name, it was a promise. Inside, the studio had grown not larger in space, but richer in life. The floors, once gleaming and cautious, now bore gentle scuffs and shoe marks that told stories of trial, courage, and return. There were more scarves now, more soft percussion instruments, and on one side of the room, a shelf full of sketchbooks and crayons for the children who couldn't yet find movement through body, but found it through line and color. Noah sat near the window that day, his chair positioned just off to the side, where the sunlight fell through at an angle that made the dust in the air look like tiny stars. He was still quiet mostly, but he watched with full awareness, blinking slower now when something moved him. His legs didn't tremble when the bell on his wrist chimed. He made it chime, deliberately. Dominic sat next to him, not saying much, hands resting loosely on his knees, body relaxed in a way that hadn't been possible a year ago. He no longer arrived wearing layers of defense. He came in cotton and quiet. Ariel walked the studio with a clipboard, stopping to check on a new student's fit with their brace. Her manner was attentive, but never patronizing. She asked questions softly, Let the children show her and never made movement a goal. It was always an invitation. Catherine visited every Thursday now. She didn't offer advice or comments anymore. She brought fresh lemon muffins for the parents, sometimes sat in the back during class, sketching what she saw. She'd told Ariel once that she needed to keep her hands busy, or she'd cry through every class. David now handled most of the administrative duties, helping coordinate volunteers and new intakes. He'd grown into his role with a sense of purpose that felt genuine, grounded. Once skeptical of Ariel, now he referred to her simply as director. They shared a mutual rhythm in managing the chaos, one where words were fewer, but understanding ran deep. That afternoon, Ariel stepped outside to the bench just beyond the entrance. The breeze was cool. She opened a thin folder from her satchel. Inside was a flight itinerary one way for 2 months later. A center in Oregon had reached out. They wanted help setting up a program based on her methods, no choreography, just invitation. She hadn't said yes yet, but she hadn't said no. Dominic joined her minutes later holding 2 cups of tea. He handed her one without a word. They sat for a long moment watching a child in a wheelchair inside try to move a single finger in rhythm to a triangle's ring. The mother of that child sat near, eyes glassy but proud. Finally, Dominic spoke. "You're leaving." She didn't answer immediately. She looked ahead. "Not for good. But I think others need the kind of beginning we had here." He nodded. "You'll leave it standing." She looked at him. "We already did." A week later, a young girl stood at the doorway of the Pulse. She was thin, maybe 7, with pale hair and wide eyes that moved quickly but never met anyone's gaze. Her mother, flustered but kind, bent low to whisper something, then nudged her forward. The girl didn't move. Ariel walked over. She crouched low, letting her knees hit the ground. She didn't ask her name. She didn't reach out. She just said, "No rush. You move when you're ready." The girl blinked. Her eyes met Ariel's for less than a second, but it was enough. She stepped inside. That evening, Dominic found a letter taped to the inside of his office door. It wasn't signed, but he knew who had written it. It read, "Every rhythm begins in silence. Thank you for listening long enough to hear mine. A." He folded the paper carefully, slid it into his breast pocket, and turned out the light. Outside, the wind caught one of the scarves left on the balcony rail. It fluttered, then settled. No music, no movement, just a place that was ready again to begin. If you've made it here to the very last quiet moment of this long story, thank you. Truly, your presence means more than words can hold. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply witness someone else's silence, struggle, resilience, and return. If this story touched something in you, it wasn't by accident. Maybe it echoed a part of your own life. Maybe it stirred a memory you thought was long gone. Wherever in the world you are watching, from whatever your background, your name, your journey, we're grateful you were here. This story wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to connect, to remind us that dignity doesn't require perfection, that love doesn't need permission, and that healing often starts in the places no one sees. If this story moved you, please leave a like, subscribe, or simply share a comment. Tell us, where are you watching from? What part of this story stayed with you? Your voice helps keep stories like this alive, and it reminds us we're not alone in wanting a world with more grace, justice, and tenderness. We'll see you again in the next story. Until then, take gentle care of yourself and of those quiet moments that might still be waiting to be seen.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.